All right, folks, welcome back. Happy Labor Day. Today we're going to move on to Chapter 2, which starts talking about color and some of the properties that color has. In the first chapter, we talked about just these very basic ways to communicate visually. That any kind of placement or any shape or anything has a communicative property to it. For instance, a square placed in the corner at the bottom of a space is perceived differently than if it's up at the top and much larger and smaller. So we learn the size, placement, shape, all of these things are different ways to communicate. And all that's kind of under the radar, like we talked about. That's little things that we know as designers that help us communicate that the average viewer might not really pay attention to. Color is similar, but color is a little bit more pronounced, obviously. Color is one of the most effective ways to communicate. If you have a proper use of color, you can really make sure that you're getting your point across the best way you can. So let's talk a little bit about color. Start out, color is relative, first of all. And what that means is color always kind of shifts and changes a little bit based on several different things. How bright it is, what kind of light you're viewing something in, what colors are behind that or next to it. All these kind of things affect the way you perceive color. Because, technically, I guess, if we were going to get philosophical, you could say, oh, does color really exist? Because it's not really there. And that's valid, I guess. But for this discussion, for this lecture, color does exist. The reason I say that is, a green car isn't really green. It appears green because the wavelength, all the light is reflecting off of the car, and what happens with something that appears green, the green wavelengths are reflected back into our eyes, and the rest of the wavelengths, the reds and the blues and everything, are absorbed. So something appears to be green. And because of that, color is always relative, because it's going into the eye, which is unique to each person, and then it's being perceived by the brain, which is also unique. So if we showed 50 people the same color of green, it's probably going to be perceived differently by every single one of those people that sees it. So, but with that being said, there are still rules and things to keep in mind that if you know these rules, you can use color effectively. So, a few words to keep in mind when we're talking about color. First one is hue. H-U-E, and that's the distinction between color identities as defined by their wavelengths. That's what the book says. Basically, that's the color. Green, red, blue, these are all hues. Okay? Saturation is how dull or bright a color is. And the way I refer to this when I think about it is, in Illustrator or Photoshop something, the little color sliders where you can have all the yellow, 100% yellow, and then take it down 50% yellow, things like that. That's the saturation. Where a really bright red is probably very saturated red, where kind of a lighter pink would be a less saturated red, and so on. So saturation. Temperature is a color's perceived warmth or coolness. And this is based on a lot of the things in our environment. For example, red, yellow, and orange are generally considered warm colors because of the sun, fire, things like that. Cool colors, green, blue, purple, because of ice and water and things like that, are usually perceived as cool. So hue, saturation, temperature, and value is the last term, and that's basically whether a color appears light or dark. For instance, black has a much darker value than medium gray or white would. So let's talk a little bit about each one. Oh, my dryer's done. So, hue refers to the identity of a color, red, violet, blue, whatever it may be. And that is, we have a visible spectrum of light, and that is basically, like I said, what colors are reflected back into your eye to be perceived by your brain versus which colors are absorbed. That's how we see colors. And hues that we are able to perceive as pretty much absolutes, those are what we call the primary colors. That's red, yellow, and blue. All right, and then in between those, we have orange. Between red and yellow, we have orange. Between yellow and blue, we have green. And between blue and red, we have purple. Those are the secondary colors. Then we get into tertiary colors. If you remember the crayon box, where then you have red, orange, and blue, green, and all that kind of stuff. And again, this is all relative, because something red next to an orange might look slightly more orange than red next to a blue, or things like that. You just got to keep in mind that colors always have this kind of interaction between each other, so you have to be conscious of that. All right, saturation, as we talked about, is the color's intensity. For instance, something that is just 100% yellow is going to be really bright, whereas 50% yellow would be a little more neutral, and it gets closer and closer to white the further it gets down. And there's throughout the chapter there's some really interesting studies where they'll put the same color over top of several different backgrounds, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about, these optical illusions that are created where it'll the color will shift a little bit visually, even though it's really the same exact color. Value, we talked about, is the intrinsic darkness or lightness of a color. And you can see on page 88 there's some interesting studies. There's 3 shades of purple, 3 values of purple. There's a dark purple, a medium purple, and a lighter purple. And these are all the same color, the same color, but they're just perceived differently because different values. And it's important to understand these values, because if you're creating a spread or a layout and everything is the same value, all these really bright colors, these really light colors, everything is going to kind of blend together. But when you pay attention to those relationships, and you might put a few light values on top of some darker values, it's really going to set some contrast up, which makes it more visually interesting, which means the reader is going to examine it longer and it's going to stick in their head. An example of this is a good photograph. Talks about it in the book. What's considered a good photograph has a high range of value. There's shadows, midtones, and highlights that really kind of makes the figure pop out. Whereas an underexposed or an overexposed image is either going to have too much highlight, not enough shadow, or vice versa. So keep that in mind. All right, temperature, like we talked about, just some colors are perceived cool, some are perceived warm. And this is just, it's important to keep this in mind, because obviously if you're designing an ad for ice cream, chances are you don't want to use reds and oranges, things like that, because you want to, kind of communicate this idea of cool or refreshing or things like that. That's just a small example. And I'm going over this kind of quickly, but there is a lot of really good information in this book. So please read through all this and read the captions under the pictures, and this will really help you understand the concepts a lot more than just listening to me talk. All right, color relationships. This is where we start getting into the color wheel, the Albert Munsell color wheel, which is what we all probably played with in 1st and 2nd grade art class. And you can see it right here. This is the color wheel, where it shows all those primary colors, the secondary colors, tertiary colors, and then we get into color relationships. And real quick, the color wheel by Munsell, that was the original representation of this, just so you can kind of see the relationships between the colors. A guy in the 20s, a German guy, his name Johann Itten? I don't know. I knew he was German, and I knew it was the 20s, that's all. He created sort of a 3-dimensional idea of this color wheel, where, and you can see that on the other page right here, where it's got all of the colors, and then it also has different values or different saturations of the colors, where if you look right here, it's got red, it's got the brightest red out here, most saturated, and then it gradually becomes less saturated until you get to gray in the middle, a neutral color. And that's anything about 50% gray. Anytime you start losing a lot of saturation, that's referred to as neutral. So if you hear me talk about that, that's what I mean.